short video, I'm going to talk about the essentials of the music, the so-called parameters of the music, and try to explain them one by one using a keyboard and virtual studio technologies in order to elucidate my examples. We will be exploring pitch, timbre, texture, and you will have a clearer idea about what means what and where to use these particular words to define parameters of music. As you see, I have a keyboard here. So this keyboard is actually attached to the software you see running on my screen. This is a digital audio workstation. So right now you see when I talk, some faders are already moving. Besides, I have actually armed a track, meaning that I'm running a virtual instrument here, and it's going to provide me with a variety of pitches by toggling in different what we call presets. So I'm first going to start off with sound. Therefore, we will be talking about pitch and timbre. For sound, we can talk that there is a representation as a waveform. It's a visual representation of what kind of a shape is emitted. So what emits sound here is what I call oscillators. So I'm just switching from pitch to pitch. Using different pitches means I'm pressing different keys on my keyboard. Now I'm going to switch between presets, meaning I'm going to shift timbre. Now this is very unlike that first sound. Even if I play the same pitch, let's see, this is an E. Now I'm going to play that same E with different timbres. As you see, the frequency remains constant, but the resultant impression on my ears is very different because the timbre is changing. Timbre is basically tone color. We each individually have, just like our fingerprints, our individual voices, our individual timbres, and same goes with different instruments. Actually, this I have is a synthesizer on my screen, so it can create or emulate timbres that are reminiscent of real instruments. When I, for instance, circulate between these will be reminiscent of a keyboard instrument. As you see, they are not real instruments. They are just facsimiles of, for instance, here, an electric piano. So pitch is basically the frequency value, and timbre is basically the tone color. What we can hear on my keyboard is actually from very low to very high, and this is not even our entire hearing range. Human ears can pick up to 20,000 hertz, which is actually pretty high. The older you get, the more higher frequencies you lose. So you guys are going to hear very easily around 18K, where I'm supposed to hear somewhere like 15K. And as you grow older, your higher frequencies go. That's why sometimes you see elderly people wearing hearing aids. Those things augment those higher frequencies, so they aid in understanding speech, for example, that contains very high formants. Here's some more on pitch and timbre. Actually, what you see on the screen are much more simpler representations of what you see on my instruments screen here. This is actually a wavetable, and it consists of different waveforms. different shapes that create different timbres. This is just a representation, of course, a visual representation. Real instruments can get to have very complex spectrums. The note you see here is called the middle C. It is the middle C because when you see a grand staff, meaning these 5 lines, and when you see the grand staff, which is created, designed to represent all the plausible notes for music making, you will be using more than one clef. Actually, you will not only be using this treble clef, sol anahtarı we call in Turkish. You will also use the bass clef. Then this note sits right in the middle. So the highest for the bass clef, the lowest for the treble clef, and it sits right at the middle of my piano. We talked already about this do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, where they come from, how did they acquire those names, what are the pitches are really called. Actually, we collect pitches into what we call scales. These are for creating some sort of directional and dimensional sense. The ordering is actually usually frequency-wise, meaning that when you play a scale, this is the scale of D major, for instance. This is the chord of D major. D is this pitch. I'm just playing like multiple Ds now. And multiple octaves. You are going to hear that it's almost as if I'm exploring the same building from different floors simultaneously. So it is still the same scale no matter where, from which octave I start. If I were to, for instance, play 2 different scales, this would be the result. Now I play the C major and the D major scale simultaneously. They don't sound very well together. Even if 2 pitches that usually fit will have a bizarre combination. So you need to really have like one particular scale for a composition as your leading scale. You can actually travel between these different scales. We call this modulation. It's a very much used trait in Western music. It just gives us a sense of adventure and homecoming. All possible pitches in the octave are actually called the chromatic scale. Chroma means color, so a chromatic scale includes all colors. Now again from D. This is D to D, 1 octave, and within our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 different pitches. The 13th is the equivalent of the first. So in the chromatic scale, you have all steps of possible tuning for Western music. Actually, tuning is another example. Tuning means that all these half steps, we call them, are equal in terms of the distance between those two. So when the distance is smaller, it sounds very bad together. When you extend the distances to, for instance, 5 notes, 6 notes, 3 notes, 4 notes, 3 again, 2.5, 5, 8. They sound well together, but the close but inverted forms of intervals, such as this one or this one, do not sound very well. Close notes are what we call a dissonance. They clash. Their overtone series clash. It's like wearing black and brown together. They don't really fit very well. This is actually a device. Dissonance is a device that composers learn to manipulate very well. They tend to first saturate our ears with dissonances and then resolve everything back to the pleasant consonants that we all long for and come back home to. So it is a very useful device in Western music to create sort of a restless, unsettled feeling and then come back to peace and resolution. The human pitch perception is relative, meaning that we do hear intervals, but you don't necessarily hear what those intervals particularly are, where they are from. Thus, when I play a fifth, my ear says it's all fifths, the same interval, but actually I'm playing different fifths. So right now I'm playing a fifth from C5, which gives me this. I'm playing a fifth from E flat 4. I'm playing a fifth from D3, or a fifth from F sharp 2. The content stays the same, the feeling stays the same, but I'm constantly changing the pitch. We are hearing yet the relations actually. That's how when the same melody is played somewhere else, you don't really mind. That's how you find your place while singing and just sink easily or settle easily into the melody that is being sung. So when you think of, for instance, a birthday song, if I were to play it from a totally different location, it would still sound like the birthday song to you. Let me play it from here. Our ears recognize that intervallic pattern between these different pitches to get the unity that we know as the melody of the birthday song. So it doesn't really matter where my reference point is, where you start, actually, as long as you follow that particular melody's pattern, is irrelevant. So the tonal center of my particular renderings of the birthday song always change. The first one was actually from C major. My tonal center was the pitch C. Listen closely, it always wants to come to C. I added another line to really highlight the feeling that it's centered around the pitch C. If I change the tonal center and play it from, say, the tonal center of F, now my C doesn't really sound like the tonal center. I'm just repeating the same. Now I'm going to use the same with D. Let's see if it works. It really doesn't work at all because the tonal center is actually F in this rendering. When I play it with F all the time, it's going to work very well. A tad boring perhaps, but our ears accept it. Let us explore texture a bit. Texture is something that's very easily demonstratable, but not very easily spoken about. Now that I have an instrument at my disposal, this is very easy. That same birthday song, when I play just with one hand, is a monophonic piece. When I play with that drone, that long held note, now this is the texture that I have here labeled as a biphony. My bi consists of the moving line and the long held, what we call drone. Actually, even if when the drone moves a little bit, this would still be biphonic. Listen to this, which will sound better. So my drone moves between these two pitches, actually, these two, what we call functions in music. We call the tonal center the tonic, and the tone that leads to it, really like pulls to it, the dominant, baskın deriz Türkçe, ya da dominant deriz. So instead of that, of course, I simplified everything else. I simplified all the other functions. So instead of just one single tonal center drone, I used also the dominant, which enriched actually what I do, but it's still a biphonic texture. So what happens when you explore a heterophonic texture? More or less like this. So they're not really independent. I'm playing with both hands the same melody, but from different octaves and with different ornamentations. It sounds richer than a monophony, but it's still not something that's individually layered. And I couldn't resist, but did a little bit of counterpoint, so I didn't play the same melody. My hands moved separately. This actually is what I call a polyphonic texture. If I were to play, instead of just the same melody with both hands, if I were to play a counter melody, instead of playing the same melody with both hands, if my hands were doing different things at given times, then this would be polyphony. And this is the most complicated thing in Western music, basically. You have to really work out each individual line. Two melodies existing simultaneously. This is really something hard to achieve and hard to write. There were great masters of polyphony, actually. Right now, I'm going to play you a piece by Johann Sebastian Bach, just the opening, to demonstrate. And my both hands will be playing two individual melodies. One will be doing this. And the other one, this. Let's hear them together. Sorry for my lousy playing, but I think it demonstrates. Finally, most of the music that we hear are actually homophonic. This is very easy to understand. That same piece by Bach, if it were like this, would have been homophonic. Then I would have one leading melody and chords to support it. These wouldn't mean much individually. I could just construct something totally different on those very same chords. Just improvise the simple melody on those very same chords. So the individuality is still the leading melody. This is the homophonic texture, and most music that you know of probably is homophonic. Harmony is those rules that govern what the chords are doing. The same progression. I know that these chords are going to flawlessly join because by rules of harmony, it is dictated that after this chord, I can't play this chord. It needs to go to this. Harmony is those rules that govern all this, and they're really settled upon after centuries upon centuries of practice. So you can create very complicated, very elegant textures by just following the rules of harmony, by following just simple chord progressions that are staple harmonic progressions. For instance, this one, there are thousands of songs written on this very same harmonic progression. So it's these chords, what we call the Phrygian tetrachord. This has been used since the ancient era. It's a fail-safe formula, basically. Counterpoint, on the other hand, is just the bass line moving in contrary motion with the melody. So it's also another set of rules, simultaneous combination of distinct melodic lines together, especially the bass and the melody. When they move in counterpoint, it's usually a much more exciting music. And polyphony is usually made out of motions of counterpoint. You can even set the same melody in counterpoint with itself. Here is a two-part invention by C major by J.S. Bach. I will play another invention for you. It's the same melody, like folded upon itself. And finally, form. Form is perhaps the simplest to understand because it's everywhere. Every song has a form. Every song has distinct elements and repetitions within. We usually label these individual themes as abstractly as letters, A, B, C, whatever. To demonstrate, actually, you could pretty much use almost all the available popular music material too. Here is actually a Renaissance or even like medieval song by Machot. So you probably know this song that I'm going to perform. It starts with an intro. I'm repeating it. Kicking me out, you got my head spinning, no kidding, I can't pin you down. This is my A section actually, this is sort of a standalone piece of music. I'm going to repeat it now. What's going on in that beautiful mind? I'm on your magical mystery ride, and I'm so dizzy, don't know what it's me, but I'll be all right. I'm going to move into a new section now. New material is coming. My head's underwater, but I'm breathing fine. You're crazy and I'm out of my mind. This was my B section. For the chorus, on the same chords, it's built as a different melody. 'Cause all of me loves all of you. Love your curves and all your edges, all your perfect imperfections. Give your all to me, give my all to you. You're my end and my beginning, even when I lose, I'm winning. So you see that with limited material, I can make multiple sections of a piece. This one is a pretty straightforward piece. Even the most complicated music has its internal workings of repeats. And this is what we call form, basically, how those repeated themes are organized. Even in pieces that seemingly flow throughout, like a piano sonata or a symphony, even operas, they have recurrent material all the time so that you are not lost. You know how to associate those particular repeated material with that piece, basically. I hope this has been helpful. I hope I was able to elucidate some matters. Sorry for my voice. I know it's not great, but it was the best I could do to really give you some insights and some understanding about music. See you in the next lecture.